Thanks everyone for joining today's Space Syntax Lab seminar. This is the final, but certainly not the least session of this term. I'm very much looking forward to welcome Dr. José Paiva Neto, who will present part of his doctoral work on travel time accessibility and the distribution of retail concentrations. José recently completed a PhD in transport engineering at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where he also earned an MSc following his graduation in civil engineering and an international training at the Cork University of Technology in Ireland. His work sits at the interface of urban form, accessibility, and public transport planning, with a focus on land use and transport interaction as a policy evaluation tool. In parallel to his academic research, Jose has also contributed to university-linked applied projects and consultancy engagements that provide technical assessments of transport services and mobility plans, translating analysis into practical inputs for planning and decision making. And before I hand over to Jose, if you have any questions during the talk, please put them in the chat so we can address them at the very end during our Q&A. And with this, I'd like to hand over to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Kimon, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm José. As he said, I'm a PhD graduate at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And today I'd just like to share with you some of the insights I stumbled across the way of my PhD. And in that sense, the talk today is named Travel Time Accessibility and the Geography of Retail Concentration. So, for starters, there's the question of where does retail locate and why. So, here's a map of Rio de Janeiro in which the hotspots, they represent the higher retail concentrations in the city. We can see a marked concentration by the southeast, which is, of course, where the city started, and it is natural that there would be the strongest concentration. But then, even though the city spread to the north and to the west, there remains still a large concentration in that part, and retail followed thinly the population growth of the city. This is a place that has about 55 kilometers from west to east and about 25 from north to south. So there is a question as to what holds this concentration there in the southeast and why retail did not follow accordingly. So I worked under the contention that that is related to the transport networks and how they mediate access to both population and income. And the findings in the paper, which this talk is based on, they suggest that the thing is that retail tends to follow very closely the income rather than population. And that is important in a context like Rio, given the large income disparity that we have in the city. So I will elaborate on that further as the talk goes on. So considering the literature review, just briefly, I'd say that broadly, there are two main strands that I could find. There are the space syntax and configurational studies, which mainly employ integration and choice centrality metrics, or rather closeness centrality, between the centrality, or some variations of these, as they are related to potential to movement and through movement. It is only reasonable to assume that these are important to commercial clustering. And the results tend to, or previous studies show that places with high integration and high choice, they tend to have consistently a larger concentration of retail, and this holds mostly across many cities and contexts. And then there are transport accessibility studies that use as explanatory variables proximity to rail, bus stops, or highways infrastructures. But then usually what I see is just proximity to such infrastructures without taking into account service travel time, service quality, and levels of service. And of course, that proximity to, say, a bus stop means practically nothing if there are no regular services in that area. So the incorporation of such variables would be important. But having that said, most studies, they show that the presence of rail infrastructure, they tend to have the most consistent and positive effects throughout, whereas highways and buses, this sort of infrastructure, it tends to have mixed results as it's apparently depends on whichever mode is more dominant in a given context. But again, operation attributes remain largely absent. And during the literature review, there was also an argument to be made that if you think about the accessibility provided by by private transport, it tends to be associated with a more homogeneous accessibility landscape. So if you compare this to transit, accessibility tends to be more peaked and marked along the principal transit corridors and transport hubs. So thus creating a spatial differentiation that could be more interesting for or favoring a retail concentration, because from the point of view of the car, it doesn't matter as much where you locate, so to speak, I mean, broadly speaking. So in terms of a few contributions of the work, it consists of employing real travel time data, not just network topology, and for both private and public transport networks. And the point here being that in today's world, I mean, proximity is actually better measured in terms of time travel or generalized costs. And also, instead of just assuming a network consisting of separated modes, of separated infrastructures, I composed a multimodal network consisting of all the bus services and rail and walking together into a single network, and the measures of centrality and access have been computed in such network. In terms of the main finding, it's just they imply to some extent that retail locates where purchasing power is more reachable. That in some ways can be somewhat intuitive, that wealthier neighborhoods could display a higher concentration of retail. But then there's a question as to what defines really a neighborhood. So the point is that if you consider the networks and travel times, we can just model this neighborhood and thus control how much income can be within reach of each location, and thus creating a favorable environment for concentration. But then concerning why Brazil and why Rio, there's the matter of the modal share. I mean, if you Latin American and Caribbean cities, they have a particular modal share that is less biased towards the automobile and more strongly, and it is more strong concerning transit modes. While North American cities, as most of us know, they have a higher bias towards the automobile, while Europe has a more diverse pattern. And so there's the point that if you focus on Rio specifically, there's a reasonably high percentage of trips that take transit modes, and a relatively low percentage of trips that happen on private modes. And in Rio, as in much large Brazilian cities, the bus network is responsible for a larger share of all the trips that happen within the city, largely surpassing rail. And there's the ferry in Rio, but that's a really small percentage. And it's even more highly pronounced than the private modes. So incorporating better the bus transport network and this level of service could be more interesting to investigate such dynamics in the context such as Rio or similar cities. And there's also the matter of income distribution. Rio, as in many other places in Brazil, has a marked income differentiated space, and the distance between the wealthiest and the poorest is really high. And in the suburbs to the north and to the west, there's a high concentration of population with lower income. So the point I try to investigate is whether transport can be used as a tool to improve the catchment area around given locations. The reasoning being that if people don't have as much purchasing power, transport could maybe help creating larger catchments in which the purchasing power within it can constitute a more sustainable place for retail location. So in terms of question and roadmap, there's the point I already mentioned that Brazilian cities, they tend to have a highly overloaded CBD. It is a recurring feature of our cities, and that transit could maybe in principle support new commercial hubs outside the center. There's a problem also that the transport networks here, they tend to drive people towards the center while short-circuiting intermediate centers in between. So there's this connectivity problem that helps make matters even worse. So in this talk, I'll focus on Rio de Janeiro, and I'll employ mostly travel time accessibility measures and the Freeman-Crafts centrality measure, which is basically a modifier between the centrality measure. And then I use machine learning algorithm and Shapley explanatory values to try and make sense of some of the relationships. And then I move on to results and possible policy implications and ways forward. This is just a starting work, and so there are many ways in which this work could be polished and gaps that could be filled. So in terms of methodological framework, the basic unit of analysis is an hexagonal grid. So I took the urban footprint of the city, and it was tessellated using the Uber's H3 hexagonal grid. And so this is the basic unit of analysis, and all variables are inputted within each hexagon. Perform the analysis. So concerning the main target-dependent variable, it is the secondary retail of the city, which is mostly smaller scale shops, cafes, and services that both serve wider local neighborhoods, or they are drawn by primary anchors. I do not use as target variable the primary anchors of the city, which would be the main business centers, really large retailers, and financial sector, and so on and so forth. The main database, it comes from HISE here. It refers to a national database in Brazil, which holds all formal service and retail activity in the country. It has an associated postal code, which has been used to geolocate those places along the territory of the city. And then that's what has been spatially smoothed throughout the city. So instead of just using the raw counts within each cell, I took the retail count of each cell and its neighboring cells, along with the building footprint area of the same cell and its surrounding cells, so as to create a more smooth surface, as the postal code can create some sort of artificial concentration in an excessive way. And then the results have been log transformed to reduce skewness and thus lead to a more well-behaved model, so to speak. And then concerning the first independent variable, it is basically accessibility measure, gravity-based, and with a log logistic decay. So I measured how much population can reach each location and how much of the income mass of the city can reach each location, and that has been weighted by travel time. And then I applied a decay, which is log logistic, because that's the best empirical fit across all modes based on data from the household travel surveys. So the socioeconomic data came from the demographic census. And for transit travel types, I've used the R5Pi routing engine, which is a Python library freely available, a GTFS feed, kindly leased by MoveIt, and the OpenStreetMap road network. And as for the car travel times, I use Pandana, which is another Python library. And as the actual travel times, the actual speeds during peak time are not present in OpenStreetMap, these have been imputed using Google Maps API. So there's the first group of variables, and then they resulted in these maps. So in the bottom, there's the accessibility provided by private transport, which is more spread out throughout the territory when you compare it to the bus, which is mostly more constrained to some of the main transport corridors in the city. And if you look at access to income in the left and compare it to access to population in the right, there is a clear shift towards the southeast, of course, which is the most wealthy region in the city. And if we consider population, things spread a lot more towards the north and to the west. And then moving on, there was this, which is the Freeman-Kraft centrality, which is basically a bit modified between a centrality measure proposed by a Brazilian professor named Kraft. And the main idea in here is that in the classic betweenness, each node receives a score as it is part of a shortest path between two endnodes. But in here, this score will be higher if the node is in a path between nodes with higher weights. And weights here meaning the floor space area in any nodes. So if betweenness is trying to assess the potential through movement, it is more likely that the through movement will be higher if a given node is between places with higher floor space area when compared to a node that is in between nodes, which are, I mean, when you compare it to a node that's in a path that connects no place to nowhere. And this even has parallels to a version that was made in the work of Andrei Sevtsuk from MIT. And also, there's a sort of distance decay imbued here, like reflecting the weakening of interactions with distance. And so the weights, as I said, are the built-in floor space in each location, which came from a City Hall database. And again, the transit network was built using a GTFS feed and the OpenStreetMap pedestrian network, which have been incorporated into a single multimodal network. And for the road network, I've used, again, the OpenStreetMap, but with the speeds imputed again from the Google Maps API. So we could have like use the travel times here to compute shortest paths instead of pure distance. And these have been implemented using QGIS extension by Tausin and Krafta being the same one who proposed such measure. And so these are the results for each variable, and there are distinct corridors for each mode, as we can see. And there's also the point that the more central corridors for transit, they tend to lean a little bit more towards the southeast. and to the center of the city, as the network of the city tends to. It was thought out to bring people to the center. So even people who do not want to go to the center, they have to go through there to go someplace else. Whereas for the car, you have really much more alternatives. There are tunnels crossing this part here, which is kind of a mountain, so to speak. But then there's rarely any buses who do that for some reason. And then there's the diversity index, which is basically a reflection of the land use entropy, because there's the point of agglomeration effects, and that retail would be more attracted to more vibrant and diverse neighborhoods. So this variable seemed important to be incorporated. Details can be found on the work of Simons, and I think it's not really necessary to delve into that here, but it is basically a measure of the land use mix within each local neighborhood. And then these are the results before imputation, and we can see some hotspots of diversity across the city, being the center being the main one. So there are areas that already show some high diversity that maybe could be focused and fostered in some ways with this or other methods. Then moving on, there is the urban well-being index, which is just a way to measure, let's say, the quality of the urban environment. So it would capture like the overall look and feel, that is whether there are trees in the neighborhood, whether there are open sewers or not, if the trash is properly collected, whether there are proper infrastructure for water, for electricity, and general urban services and infrastructure. These are computed at the census tract level, so there is likely some modifiable aerial unit problem here occurring, but then that was the finest resolution available in the census tract. And finally, there's violent crime, which can be a problem in the city, some of you may know. So the thing here was try to incorporate something that reflected public security, which here is the average of violent crimes per police precinct in each area of the city. And then again, the police precincts, which is the smallest unit available, it is considerably larger than the hexagonal grid. So there are again some issues that might occur here because of this mismatch. So sometimes it happens that a large red area, it may be pretty violent, but then it could be concentrated into just a few small portions. So that can be misleading in some way, but it was an attempt to incorporate public security in some way. So to sum it up, it was basically the access variables, as I mentioned, the accessibility matrix, then the centrality matrix, represented by the Freeman-Crafter centrality, and then the diversity metric, which is the land use entropy, built environment quality, and the violent crime incidence. So that's all of that to try to explain the concentration of secondary retail activity in the city, which is the dependent variable or the target variable. So in terms of modeling approach, I first tried to employ a general spatial econometrics framework, but then the data seemed pretty badly behaved. So it pretty much violated several assumptions that of the spatial econometrics framework. So I ended up employing a machine learning algorithm, XGBoost, which is a decision tree algorithm, which it can better handle some more complex variable interactions and some nonlinearities. And it also handles better a little bit of multiple linearity up to a point. So these have been trained on a 5-fold cross-validation on 80% of the data and validated on the remaining 20. And so the R-squared for the problem was about 0.7, whereas some of the traditional spatial econometrics approach, I found they were around 0.1. And then there's the GeoShapley, which is basically a modification of the Shap values. And roughly speaking, I don't think it's really on point to delve into that here, but it is just a way to understand feature importance given the black box nature of some machine learning algorithms. So it basically tries to measure how much each variable matter for a given outcome. So in a way, it's like the parameters of a linear regression, roughly speaking. And I employ the GeoShapley, which is a variation of the traditional Shapley values which are in spatially explicit extension. And I will explain that. I think it might be clearer as I go on. So coming to the main results, I will just talk about this briefly because I think the next slide is a bit more clear than this. But then one of the traditional results of the Shapley values is a swarm plot such as this. And if we take, for instance, variables are ranked according to the importance to the model. And as to the interpretation of this, if we take diversity, for example, in the second row, each point reflects one observation or one of those hexagonal cells I mentioned, and the color grading represents the value of that feature. So the pinkish values, they represent hexagons where diversity is high, and the blue values represent places where such diversity is low. And the more a point is to the right, it means that it impacts the model positively. It's the impact on model prediction. So in diversity, for instance, the pinkish values represent high diversity. They are more to the right, so they push predictions of retail concentration up, whilst the blue represents places where diversity is low, and so they push predictions down. But then maybe a better way to present the results is in this global feature contribution rank, which also ranks the impact of each variable. So high above larger bars, they represent variables with more impact. And here is just a summary or mean contribution of each variable, which is derived from this plot here. But then one distinction here, which is different from the previous one, is that, as I said, the method to explain the feature importance, it can divide the effects of each variable into primary effects in blue and what is called by Fotheringham and Lee of behavioral contextual effect. So the primary effect is the location invariant influence of a variable. So the blue part, it represents like the standard behavior of a given variable throughout the whole of the study area, while the pink part, it represents the effect of that variable and how that varies with location, because the effect can be stronger at a given location or weaker at a given location, or even have reversed signs. And then one interesting point here is that geo variable. It was not mentioned before, but then that's a consequence of this approach, because there are this kind of problem, it always will have to some extent some omitted variable bias in some way or another. There are variables that are really difficult to capture and that are intrinsic to each location. So there are, for instance, historical factors, cultural, institutional, things that sometimes cannot be measured properly and vary with location, and that variable reflects that. And so having all of that said, the average impact concerning the impact of each variable, income comes across as the first one, followed by diversity, and then income access by car, and then followed the centrality measures of the Freeman-Crafter centralities, and then the population access by transit. And so just to elaborate a little bit further, I also plotted some partial dependence plots. These plots are concerned mostly the blue part of this graph. I focus on these because, time flies. So I just focused on the location invariant influence of these variables. And I'll just focus as well on the transport and network related variables in this talk. So, as I mentioned, I employed a bootstrap procedure to produce confidence intervals and have a sense of the significance of the results. And there is a point to be enhanced in the future, as confidence intervals are pretty large, let's say. But then there were also some computational limitations in the way these have been calculated. My hardware was not strong enough to do some more precise calculations, which is a thing I'll try to handle later on in the future. But then, having that said, considering the access to income as mediated by the transit network, there are seemingly increasing returns throughout the range. So mostly as access to income by transit grows, so does the percent change in retail. And places with very low access, they tend to have they are penalized. When we consider the income access by car, the effects are largely either insignificant or really moderate or mild in the range. But then they become extremely negative as we move towards the more accessible areas by car. And in this case, I assume it has something to do with the fact that the places with the highest accessibility are the main roads and expressways in the city. And there are questions concerning border vacuum effects and the desire to avoid being close to such congested and trafficked places. As for the population access, it was mostly flat throughout, although places with a higher access to population, they did tend to display a higher concentration of retail, meaning maybe that after a point, the sheer volume of people would foster the need to have retail of some sort. And concerning the centrality measures, these are the Freeman-Crafter centralities, the modified betweenness, as I mentioned, and on the left on the multimodal transit network, and on the right made by the private modes network. So both grow up to a point, and then they tend to plateau to a bit, suggesting that after a given point, centrality doesn't really add up that much. But then the plateau of the transit has been somewhat higher than the plateau of the car centrality, suggesting a somewhat more strong tendency of retail to cluster around the main transit corridors instead of the main road corridors. So moving on to the end, there is the point that transit and network centrality, transit accessibility and network centrality seem to have a prominent role, let's say, put it this way, into helping shape retail concentration. And there's also the point that, which needs to be investigated further, I'll come to that later on, that retail locates where purchasing power is reachable via the network. So maybe in places in which purchasing power on average is not that high, transit can be used to increase the market area so as to have a more substantial income catchment area. And so thus supporting the emergence of new commercial hubs. And there's also ties to the fact that transport access is so thin in the city that just increasing it and making for more connected neighborhoods would likely tend to have positive results, as I do remember this work by Karen Lucas and Bastiansen in the transport reviews, where they made a meta-analysis and show that increasing the accessibility by transit was related to more economic development and more employment for several parts of the population, while writers like Alain Berthaud argue that productivity is really tightly related to how much you can access within a 60-minute catchment area. But one should take heed of the possible problem concerning gentrification as well, because we've had cases in which, let's say, there's the case of Curitiba, for instance, which is kind of a cautionary tale of sorts, in which the land along the BRT corridors of the bus rapid transit corridors in the city, it has been highly valued and desirable. So lots of the higher income population and retail and services clustered around such locations. But then the land prices went so high that the people who really use the BRT, they have been pushed towards other areas of the city in which the BRTs are not present. So along the main corridors now, there live people who don't really use the BRT and they actually drive. Concerning some limitations, there's the fact that, as I mentioned, the database consisted of formal retail only. There's not really a strong and robust database concerning the informal sector, which is highly considerable in the city, although data from the Household Travel Survey suggests that there's a high correlation between the location of formal retail and informal retail. There's also the matter of zoning, because most of the database is from around the 2010s and a little bit later on, but I intended to use the zoning of the period, but then the zoning of the period consisted of a largely and cumbersome and fragmented set of laws accumulated really over the span of decades. So with no consistent spatial layer associated. So it was a set of rules dispersed over several legislations, which was not really feasible to make sense of it. They tried to correct it in the last zoning plan, so I think it would be better that they are better off now. And also, it may be more critical, there's the problem of the illegal production of space in the city, which is a thing I don't really know so far how to incorporate, because there are large parts of the territory of the city that are controlled by militias and armed groups, sometimes with the complicity of the state. And such groups today, they center on real estate production and on the provision of urban services. So this creates a somewhat distortion, which is really difficult to capture, and there is an avenue for research in the future. So concerning future work, causal inference is a difficult thing to do, and it would be best done if you think about panel data or in cross-city comparisons to strengthen such, to make a little bit more robust and strong inferential assumptions. There is the need to incorporate informal retail via other data sources. And there are also works that I found that weighted the centrality measures using actual flow data from smart cards or other kinds of data sources and sensors. So this could maybe make for more reliant results, because I did use the levels of service of transit, for instance, but then there's the point that a given place might have a large flow of buses, but these buses might happen to be empty or nearly empty, so that could change things a bit. And then one thing I found as I was just finishing up the paper and I want to investigate in the future concerns double machine learning methods, which seem to be a more robust way to treat against confounders and to make more robust inferential claims using machine learning. And finally, the metrics I've used, they are mostly global. And it would be interesting to try and contain the analysis to more local neighborhoods or in a spatially stratified approach to see how that behaves. So, as I said, there is much yet to be done. This was just a first attempt and initial attempt. And I intend to follow up with that in the future and try to close the gaps I found out throughout the process. So thank you. Obrigado. And I give the floor back to you.